Probably more on the more permissive side of this whole spectrum. I think that I agree with everybody here that in the near term, the research should go forward. I don't see much of a big problem with sort of synthesizing yeast, genomes and or studying sort of aspects of the human genome. My view is that what we need is a really robust ethical framework. And within this robust ethical framework, I think there's a way going forward where we can do this ethically. But there's actually a lot of opportunities for this to solve big world problems. So one thing is the climate change. And there, I'll just use, climate change is a really big problem. We don't really know how to solve it. But it turns out that we can use human engineering to help us address climate change. So I'll give two examples. So one is that people eat too much meat, right? And if they were to cut down on their consumption of meat, then it would actually really help the planet. But people are not willing to give up meat. Yeah, some people will be willing to, but other people, they may be willing to, but they have a weakness of will. They say, wow, this steak is just too juicy. I can't do it. I'm one of those, by the way. So, so here's the thought, right? So it turns out that we know a lot about, we have these intolerance to, for example, I have milk intolerance. And some people are intolerant to crayfish. So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine proteins. And there's actually analogs of this in life. There's this thing called the Lone Star tick, where if it bites you, you'll become allergic to meat. I can sort of describe the mechanism. So that's something that we can do through human engineering. We can kind of possibly address really big world problems through human engineering. Another example is,
you go first.
Yeah, and another example is and here I'll go first, right? You'll see that I'm the smallest person here, right? And Amy's the smallest person. So it turns out that the larger you are, think of the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions that are required to the energy that's required to transport larger people rather than smaller people, right? But if we're smaller just by 15 centimeters, right? That's a mass, I did the math, and it's about mass reduction of 25%, which is huge. And 100 years ago, we're all on the average smaller, exactly about 15 centimeters smaller. Right? So think of just the, lifetime greenhouse gas emissions if we had smaller children, right? And so that's something that we could do through some of human...
Could we, setting aside, should we?
Yes, setting aside, should we? Well, don't need to ask that question. He's just a bioethicist, after all. Matthew Lau, as he calls himself. It's the only reason he gives lip service to a robust ethical framework, as he suggests that we should genetically engineer people against their will to be meat intolerant, or give people cat-like eyes that reduce the need for lighting at night because of our carbon footprint. Or we can genetically engineer our children to be the size of cats because over the lifetime they'll have less greenhouse gas emissions. These are his suggestions, and ladies and gentlemen, yes, they sound crazy, don't they? They sound equally ludicrous as vaccine passports sounded 18 months ago. But given the right crisis, and given the appropriate amount of fear pushed out through the propaganda outlets, you can see how people would line up for these things just as they are, virtue signaling as they get their kill shots right now. And it's not just Matthew Lau who's out there saying these crazy things. No, he is walking hand in hand with Klaus Schwab and the people at the World Economic Forum, how bioengineering will change our world in the next 10 years. This is what it means when he talks about biohacking and cybernetics as part of the Great Reset, as part of this fourth industrial revolution, engineering a post-human world, where, as you can read right here, citizens vaccinated by consuming edible vaccines and plants. Well, no wonder they need control over the food supply. No wonder it's going to be illegal for you to have a garden, right? Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is their plan, and there's no one coming to save you. I'm sorry to tell you. It's going to be up to you to get the word out and for all of us to fight this right now. And why am I talking about this? Why is Christian going off about, humans the size of cats. What does this have to do with food? Because if I just say that they're shutting off the world food supply, then I sound crazy. But it's not until we have a cup of tea, pine needle tea, and acknowledge their own words, their own plans are so crazy, are so satanic, and this transhumanist future that they have envisioned is being created by virtue of this huge crisis, this worldwide famine, climate change. They'll blame for it. And I'm not the only one saying this at this point. In fact, just last week, a Dutch member of parliament stood up and saying, we're going to have food shortages if we keep replacing our fertile agricultural lands with these wind farms. This is insanity, and it must stop. Well, now that we've taken, I'm not holding back anymore, ladies and gentlemen. I never did, but at this point, we've got to be all in. And so that's why I wanted to really do the deep dive into the motivations behind why they're just turning off the food. And now let's talk more about how they're doing that.
With drastic limits placed on what little water they have.
We've all made serious choices of what fields we can water and what we can't.
Tom Favero says he and many farmers along this west side of Weber County are having to watch some crops die. People like Dean Martini.
That corn there where I can't water it, don't have the water, makes me sick to see it go to heck like that.
With limits on amount and time, he says there isn't enough flow to make it across his fields. While some of the corn is drying up, he's had to let this whole field of barley go.
That hurts, buddy. That hurts.
All after he's put the work in.
Plowing, put fertilizer and everything on, and then see this. That makes a guy sick.
It all means less feed for his dairy. He'll have to try and buy from other farmers who also have shortened supply, driving prices up.
If we ain't gonna have it, then yeah, cows are gonna have to go too.
Favero, who only grows feed, says he won't have enough to go around.
We're going to be back in production at least 30% of what normal should be. And hopefully we're only at a lack of 30%. It might be closer to 50%.
And the key phrase in there was, the animals will have to go too. The cows will go. You can see this isn't just bad for crop production. This is, in fact, an attack on ranching as well. Now moving on to California, and I hope you saw the first piece I did on the drought water wars, where we could pretty clearly demonstrate that we had more than 5 years worth of water 18 months ago, and somehow it's just gone. This is clearly an engineered drought, a manufactured situation we find ourselves in. It continues to get worse and worse until just a few days ago, the federal government actually said, we're going to cut those allocations to zero. You're now going to get no water. And some of the reactions from farmers are pretty desperate.
Paddocks once packed with tomatoes to cotton in Salvador Parra's farm now look like a barren wasteland. As California suffers its worst drought since 1977, everyone, from farmers like Parra down to the average consumer, will soon be feeling the heat. A third of Parra's 6,000-acre Burford Ranch now lies fallow, and he's had to dig deep for water for the remaining crops.
Because of this drought, we're having to pipe water from another well. It's 4 miles, taking us 4 miles worth of pipeline to get this water here.
Parra fears that consumers will soon pay the price.
So consumers should be worried about garlic and onions and other crops, because come this time next year, they're going to be very scarce and the cost is going to be higher. Most of the garlic in the United States is grown here in California, and so not having the water, growers will not be able to grow it.
California is one of the country's top producers of vegetables, berries, and all sorts of crops.
The warning from the state to thousands of farmers that their water could be shut off is more than just a cautionary notice for the agricultural community.
Well, essentially, if you don't have a well, you're really facing some hard times.
Farmers say this could lead to catastrophe.
We've already seen about 15% of our workforce severely impacted by this drought.
The State Water Resources Board notified 6,600 farmers Tuesday that they could face water cutoffs as the state deals with the ongoing drought, dry conditions that have already cut off federal and state irrigation supplies.
We are seeing unprecedented amounts of fallowing. We've already lost several corn crops across the state.
Anya Radaba says a number of farmers have fallowed land, meaning acres will not be used, left untouched.
If you have orchards or vineyards and you're told to cut back your water, cut off your water, you're essentially killing that. that orchard or that vineyard.
Bruce Blodgett says what could happen is that smaller operations may have no choice but to shut down, which could lead to layoffs and a loss of revenue for county governments.
For those that have permanent crops, this could be devastating.
The state says the cutoff may continue until winter rains come. In the meantime, farmers do their best to mitigate potential devastation by recycling water.
And before I move on, let me just amplify a couple of the things we just heard. One, that we're also seeing hay shortages, which means farmers and ranchers are competing for the ability to feed their animals. And secondly, that we're not just cutting off water to annual crops, but also to orchards and vineyards. These are things that take tremendous amounts of capital investment, and in some cases, like almonds and walnuts, a decade to establish before they even produce. So this is a lasting reduction in our agricultural output. And the story, again, is the same across California, into Oregon, where it's also being conflated with the white nationalist, white supremacist, militia, Ammon Bundy nonsense, even as the mainstream media prints stories about QAnon supporters are going to get violent now because they can no longer trust the plan, right? So we should all be very concerned about the scripting around this false flag looming as they cut off the water to farmers and make people very desperate, because this is the pretense for the weaponization, the turning of the entire police state apparatus, and indeed even the military, against Americans. This is very concerning. I told you there was a tremendous amount of information to cover today. And if I were just doing this for clicks, if I were just some professional YouTuber and that was my shtick, then I would cut this all into little tiny bite-sized things. Oh, humans the size of cats, isn't that crazy? That's not my goal. Okay, I'm not trying to waste your time or my time. I want to have a big picture conversation about what they're doing. They're moving to a post-human world, and how they're doing it through the engineering of a global famine that we're now on the brink of. What that means is that we have to start growing food, we have to start spreading the word, we have to start saving seeds and sharing them with our neighbors so that they can grow food, and we have to quickly create a new local food system and a distributed, decentralized way of moving forward. The only alternative to their centralized, perfect control, totalitarian, technocratic state is one where we're all working together to feed ourselves. So let's start doing that today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. Please spread the word about this. You can find this report and all my reports on iceagefarmer.com.